Hello, and welcome back to Baby Elias's stories. We now return to 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. Chapter 19. Torres, Straits. During the night of the 27th or 28th of December, the Nautilus left the shores of Vanikoro with great speed. Her course was southwesterly, and in 3 days she had gone over the 750 leagues that separated it from La Perouse's group and the southeast point of Papua. Early in the 1st of January 1863, Conseil joined me on the platform. "Master, will you permit me to wish you a Happy New Year?" "What? Conseil? Exactly as if I was at Paris in my study at the Jardin des Plantes." "Well, I accept your good wishes and thank you for them. Only I will ask you what you mean by a Happy New Year under our circumstances. Do you mean the year that will bring us to the end of our imprisonment? Or the year that sees us continue this strange voyage?" "Really, I do not know how to answer, Master. We are sure to see curious things, and for the last 2 months we have not had time for dullness. The last marvel is always the most astonishing. And if we continue this progression, I do not know how it will end. It is my opinion that we shall never again see the like. I think then, with no offense to Master, that a happy year would be one in which we could see everything." On 2nd January, we had made 11,340 miles, or 5,250 French leagues, since our starting point in the Japan seas. Before the ship's head stretched the dangerous shores of the Coral Sea on the northeast coast of Australia. Our boat lay along some miles from the redoubtable bank on which Cook's vessel was lost. 10th June 1770. The boat in which Cook was struck on a rock. The boat in which Cook was struck on a rock, and if it did not sink, it was owing to a piece of coral that was broken by the shock and fixed itself in the broken keel. I had wished to visit the reef, 360 leagues long, against which the sea, always rough, broke with great violence, with a noise like thunder. But just then the inclined planes drew the Nautilus down to a great depth, and I could see nothing of the high coral walls. I had to content myself with the different specimens of fish brought up by the nets. I remarked, among others, some germans, a species of mackerel as large as a tunny, with bluish sides and stripped with transverse bands that disappear with the animal's life. These fish followed us in shoals and furnished us with every delicate food. We took also a large number of gilt heads, about 1.5 inches long, tasting like dories, and flying firefish like submarine swallows, which in dark nights light alternately the air and water with their phosphorescent light. Side note, 2 sentences missing here. End side note. 2 days after crossing the Coral Sea, 4th January, we sighted the Papuan coasts. On this occasion, Captain Nemo informed me that his intention was to get into the Indian Ocean by the Strait of Torres. His communication ended there. The Torres Strait are nearly 34 leagues wide, but they are obstructed by an innumerable quantity of islands, islets, breakers, and rocks that make its navigation almost impracticable. So that Captain Nemo took all needful precautions to cross them. The Nautilus, floating betwixt wind and water, went at a moderate pace. Her screw, like a cetacean's tail, beat the waves slowly. Profiting by this, I and my two companions went up onto the deserted platform. Before us was the steerman's cage, and I expected that Captain Nemo was there directing the course of the Nautilus. I had before me the excellent charts of the Straits of Torres, and I consulted them attentively. Round the Nautilus, the sea dashed furiously. The course of the waves, that went from southeast to northwest at the rate of 2.5 miles, broke on the coral that showed itself here and there. "This is a bad sea," remarked Ned Land. "Detestable indeed, and one that does not suit a boat like the Nautilus. The captain must be very sure of his route, for I see there pieces of coral that would do for its keel if it only touched them slightly." Indeed, the situation was dangerous, but the Nautilus seemed to slide like magic off these rocks. It did not follow the routes of the Astrolabe and the Zili exactly, for they proved fatal to Dumont d'Urville. It bore more northwards, coasted the islands of Murray, and came back to the southwest towards Cumberland Passage. I thought it was going to pass it by when going back to northwest. It went through a large quantity of islands and islets, little known, towards the Island Sound and Canal Mauve. The Canal Mauve. I wondered if Captain Nemo, foolishly imprudent, would steer his vessel into that pass where Dumont d'Urville's 2 corvettes touched. When swerving again and cutting straight through to the west, he steered for the island of Gilboa. It was then 3 in the afternoon. The tide began to recede, being quite full. The Nautilus approached the island. That I still saw, with its remarkable border of screw pines. He stood off it about 2 miles distant. Suddenly, a shock overthrew me. The Nautilus just touched a rock and stayed immovable, laying lightly to port side. When I rose, I perceived Captain Nemo and his lieutenant on the platform. They were examining the situation of the vessel and exchanging words in their incomprehensible dialect. She was situated thus. 2 miles on the starboard side appeared Gilboa, stretching from north to west like an immense arm. Towards the south and east, some coral showed itself left by the ebb. We had run aground, and in one of those seas where the tides are middling, a sorry matter for the floating of the Nautilus. However, the vessel had not suffered, for her keel was solidly joined. But if she could neither glide off nor move, she ran the risk of being forever fastened to these rocks. And then Captain Nemo's submarine vessel would be done for. I was reflecting thus when the captain, cool and calm, always master of himself, approached me. "An accident?" I asked. "No, an incident. But an incident that will oblige you perhaps to become an inhabitant of this land from which you flee?" Captain Nemo looked at me curiously and made a negative gesture, as much as to say that nothing would force him to set foot on terra firma again. Then he said, "Besides, Monsieur Aronnax, the Nautilus is not lost. It will carry you yet into the midst of the marvels of the ocean. Our voyage is only begun. and I do not wish to be deprived so soon of the honor of your company." "However, Captain Nemo," I replied, without noticing the ironical turn of his phrase, "the Nautilus ran aground in open sea. Now the tides are not strong in the Pacific, and if you cannot lighten the Nautilus, I do not see how it will be reinflated." "The tides are not strong in the Pacific. You are right there, Professor. But in Torres Straits, one finds still a difference of 1.5 yards between the level of high and low seas. Today is 4th January, and in 5 days the moon will be full. Now I shall be very much astonished if that satellite does not raise these masses of water sufficiently and render me a service that I should be indebted to her for." Having said this, Captain Nemo, followed by his lieutenant, redescended to the interior of the Nautilus. As to the vessel, it moved not, and was immovable, as if the coralline polypi had already walled it up with their indestructible cement. "Well, sir," said Ned Land, who came up to me after the departure of the captain. "Well, friend Ned, we will wait patiently for the tide on the 9th instant, for it appears that the moon will have the goodness to put it off again." "Really?" "Really." "And this captain is not going to cast anchor at all since the tide will suffice?" said Conseil simply. The Canadian looked at Conseil, then shrugged his shoulders. "Sir, you may believe me when I tell you that this piece of iron will navigate neither on nor under the sea again. It is only fit to be sold for its weight. I think, therefore, that the time has come to part company with Captain Nemo. Friend Ned, I do not despair of this stout Nautilus as you do, and in 4 days we shall know what to hold to on the Pacific tides. Besides, flight might be possible if we were in sight of the English or Provencal coast. But on the Papuan shores it is another thing, and it will be time enough to come to that extremity if the Nautilus does not recover itself again, which I look upon as a grave event." "But do they know at least how to act circumspectly? There is an island. On that island there are trees. Under those trees, terrestrial animals, bearers of cutlets and roast beef, to which I would willingly give a trial." "In this, friend Ned is right," said Conseil, "and I agree with him. Could not Master obtain permission from his friend Captain Nemo to put us on land, if only so as not to lose the habit of treading on the solid parts of our planet?" "I can ask him, but he will refuse." "Will Master risk it?" asked Conseil, "and we shall know how to rely upon the captain's amiability." To my great surprise, Captain Nemo gave me the permission I asked for, and he gave it very agreeably, without even exacting from me a promise to return to the vessel. But flight across New Guinea might be very perilous, and I should not have counseled Ned Land to attempt it. Better to be a prisoner on board the Nautilus than to fall into the hands of the natives. At 8 o'clock, armed with guns and hatchets, we got off the Nautilus. The sea was pretty calm. A slight breeze blew on land. Conseil and I rowing, we sped along quickly, and Ned steered into the straight passage that the breakers left between them. The boat was well handled and moved rapidly. Ned Land could not restrain his joy. He was like a prisoner that had escaped from prison, and he knew not that it was necessary to re-enter it. "Meat! We are going to eat some real meat. And what meat?" he replied. "Real game. No bread indeed." "I do not say that fish is not good. We must not abuse it. but a piece of fresh venison grilled on live coals will agreeably vary our ordinary course." "Glutton!" said Conseil. "He makes my mouth water." "It remains to be seen," I said, "if these forests are full of game, and if the game is not such as will hunt the hunter himself." "Well said, Monsieur Aronnaud," replied the Canadian, whose teeth seemed sharpened like the edge of a hatchet. "But I will eat tiger, loin of tiger, if there is no other quadruped on this island." "Fred Ned is uneasy about it," said Conseil. "Whatever it may be," continued Ned Land, "every animal with 4 paws without feathers, or with 2 paws without feathers, will be saluted by my first shot." "Very well. Master Land's imprudences are beginning." "Never fear, Monsieur Aronnaud," replied the Canadian. "I do not want 25 minutes to offer you a dish of my salt." At 8:30, the Nautilus boat ran softly aground on a heavy sand, after having happily passed the coral reef that surrounds the island of Gilboa. Chapter 20. A few days on land. I was much impressed on touching land. Ned Land tried the soil with his feet as if to take possession of it. However, it was only 2 months before that we had become, according to Captain Nemo, passengers on board the Nautilus, but in reality, prisoners of its commander. In a few minutes we were within musket shot of the coast. The whole horizon was hidden behind a beautiful curtain of forests. Enormous trees, the trunks of which attained the height of 200 feet, were tied to each other by garlands of bindweed, real natural hammocks, which a light breeze rocked. They were mimosas, figs, hibisci, and palm trees, mingled together in profusion, and under the shelter of their verdant vault grew orchids, leguminous plants, and ferns. But without noticing all these beautiful specimens of Papuan flora, the Canadian abandoned the agreeable for the useful. He discovered a cocoa tree, beat down some of the fruit, broke them, and we drank the milk and ate the nut with a satisfaction that protested against the ordinary food on the Nautilus. "Excellent," said Ned Land. "Exquisite," replied Conseil. "And I do not think," said the Canadian, "that he would object to our introducing a cargo of coconuts on board." "I do not think he would, but he would not taste them." "So much the worse for him," said Conseil. "And so much the better for us," replied Ned Land. "There will be more for us." "One word only, Master Ned. Master Land," I said to the harpooner, who was beginning to ravage another coconut tree. "Coconuts are good things, but before filling the canoe with them, it would be wise to reconnoiter and see if the island does not produce some substance not less useful. Fresh vegetables would be welcome on board the Nautilus." "Master is right," replied Conseil, "and I propose to reserve 3 places in our vessel, one for fruits, the other for vegetables, and the third for the venison, of which I have not yet seen the smallest specimen." "Conseil, we must not despair," said the Canadian. "Let us continue," I returned, "and lie in wait. Although the island seems uninhabited, it might still contain some individuals that would be less hard than we on the nature of game. Ho ho! Said Ned Land, moving his jaws significantly. Well, Ned, said Conseil. My word, returned the Canadian. I begin to understand the charms of anthropophagy.
Anthropophagy.
Anthropophagy. Anthropophagy, the eating of human flesh by human beings. My word, returned the Canadian. I begin to understand the charms of anthropophagy. Ned, what are you saying? You, a man-eater? I should not feel safe with you, especially as I share your cabin. I might perhaps wake one day to find myself half devoured. Friend Conseil, I like you much, but not enough to eat you unnecessarily. I would not trust you, replied Conseil. But enough. We must absolutely bring down some game to satisfy this cannibal, or else one of these fine mornings master will find only pieces of his servant to serve him. While we were talking thus, we were penetrating the sombre arches of the forest, and for 2 hours we surveyed it in all directions. Chance rewarded our search for eatable vegetables, and one of the most useful products of the tropical zones furnished us with precious food that we missed on board. I would speak of the breadfruit tree, very abundant in the island of Gilboa, and I remarked chiefly the variety, destitute of seeds, which bears in Malaya the name of rima. Ned Land knew these fruits well. He had already eaten many during his numerous voyages, and he knew how to prepare the eatable substance. Moreover, the sight of them excited him, and he could contain himself no longer. Master, he said, I shall die if I do not taste a little of this breadfruit pie. Taste it, friend Ned. Taste it as you want. We are here to make experiments. Make them. It won't take long, said the Canadian. And, provided with a lentil, he lighted a fire of dead wood that crackled joyously. During this time, Conseil and I chose the best fruits of the breadfruit. Some had not then attained a sufficient degree of maturity, and their thick skin covered a white but rather fibrous pulp. Others, the greater number yellow and gelatinous, waited only to be picked. These fruits enclosed no kernel. Conseil brought a dozen to Ned Land, who placed them on a coal fire, after having cut them in thick slices, and while doing this, repeating, You will see, master, how good this bread is. More so when one has been deprived of it so long it is not even bread, he added, but a delicate pastry. You have eaten none, master? No, Ned. Very well. Prepare yourself for a juicy thing. If you do not come for more, I am no longer the king of harpooners. After some minutes, the parts of the fruits that was exposed to the fire was completely roasted. The interior looked like a white pastry, a sort of soft crumb, the flavor of which was like that of an artichoke. It must be confessed this bread was excellent, and I ate of it with great relish. What time is it now? Asked the Canadian. 2:00 at least, replied Conseil. How time flies on firm ground, sighed Ned Land. Let us be off, replied Conseil. We returned through the forest and completed our collection by a raid upon the cabbage palms that we gathered from the tops of the trees. little beings that I recognized as the abro of the Malays, and yams of a superior quality. We were loaded when we reached the boat, but Ned Land did not find his provisions sufficient. Fate, however, favored us. Just as we were pushing off, he perceived several trees, from 25 to 30 feet high, a species of palm tree. At last, at 5 o'clock in the evening, loaded with our riches, we quitted the shore, and half an hour after, we hailed the Nautilus. No one appeared on our arrival. The enormous iron-plated cylinder seemed deserted. The provisions embarked. I descended to my chamber, and after supper, slept soundly. The next day, 6th January, nothing new on board, not a sound inside, not a sign of life. The boat rested along the edge, in the same place in which we had left it. We resolved to return to the island. Ned Land hoped to be more fortunate than on the day before with regard to the hunt, and wished to visit another part of the forest. At dawn we set off. The boat, carried on by the waves that flowed to shore, reached the island in a few minutes. We landed, and thinking that it was better to give in to the Canadian, we followed Ned Land, whose long limbs threatened to distance us. He wound up the coast towards the west, then fording some torrents, he gained the high plain that was bordered with admirable forests. Some kingfishers were rambling along the water courses, but they would not let themselves be approached. Their circumspection proved to me that these birds knew what to expect from bipeds of our species, and I concluded that if the island was not inhabited, at least human beings occasionally frequented it. After crossing a rather large prairie, we arrived at the skirts of a little wood that was enlivened by the songs and flight of a large number of birds. "There are only birds," said Conseil. "But they are eatable," replied the harpooner. "I do not agree with you, friend Ned, for I see only parrots there." "Friend Conseil," said Ned gravely, "the parrot is like pheasant to those who have nothing else." "And," I added, "this bird suitably prepared is worth knife and fork." Indeed, under the thick foliage of this wood, a world of parrots were flying from branch to branch, only needing a careful education to speak the human language. For the moment they were chattering with parrots of all colors and grave cockatoos who seemed to meditate upon some philosophical problem, whilst brilliant red lories passed like a piece of bunting carried away by the breeze. Papuans, with the finest azure colors, and in all variety of winged things most charming to behold, but few eatable. However, a bird peculiar to these lands, and which has never passed the limits of the Arrow and Papuan Islands, was wanting in this collection. But fortune reserved it for me before long. After passing through a moderately thick copse, we found the plain obstructed with bushes. I saw then those magnificent birds, the disposition of whose long feathers obliges them to fly against the wind. Their undulating flight, graceful aerial curves, and the shading of their colors attracted and charmed one's looks. I had no trouble in recognizing them. "Birds of paradise!" I exclaimed. The Malays, who carry on a great trade in these birds with the Chinese, have several means that we could not employ for taking them. Sometimes they put snares on the top of high trees that the birds of paradise prefer to frequent. Sometimes they catch them with a vicious bird lime that paralyzes their movements. They even go so far as to poison the fountains that the birds generally drink from. But we were obliged to fire at them during flight, which gave us few chances to bring them down. And indeed we vainly exhausted 1/2 our ammunition. About 11 o'clock in the morning, the first range of mountains that formed the center of the island was traversed, and we had killed nothing. Hunger drove us on. The hunters had relied on the products of the chase, and they were wrong. Happy Conseil, to his great surprise, made a double shot and secured breakfast. He brought down a white pigeon and a wood pigeon, which, cleverly plucked and suspended from a skewer, was roasted before a red fire of dead wood. While these interesting birds were cooking, Ned prepared the fruit of the bread tree. Then the wood pigeons were devoured to the bones and declared excellent. The nutmeg, with which they are in the habit of stuffing their crops, flavors their flesh and renders it delicious eating. Now, Ned, what do you miss now? Some four-footed game, Monsieur Aronnax. All these pigeons are only side dishes and trifles, and until I have killed an animal with cutlets, I shall not be content. Nor I, Ned, if I do not catch a bird of paradise. Let us continue hunting, replied Conseil. Let us go towards the sea. We have arrived at the first declivities of the mountains, and I think we had better regain the region of forests. That was sensible advice, and was followed out. After walking for 1 hour, we had attained a forest of sago trees. Some inoffensive serpents glided away from us. The birds of paradise fled at our approach, and truly I despaired of getting near one, when Conseil, who was walking in front, suddenly bent down, uttered a triumphal cry, and came back to me, bringing a magnificent specimen. Ah, bravo, Conseil! Master is very good. No, my boy, you have made an excellent stroke. Take one of these living birds and carry it in your hand. If master will examine it, he will see that I have not deserved great merit. Why, Conseil? Pourquoi? Because this bird is as drunk as a quail. Drunk? Yes, sir. Drunk with the nutmegs that it devoured under the nutmeg tree under which I found it. See, friend Ned, see the monstrous effects of intemperance. By Jove, exclaimed the Canadian, because I have drunk gin for 2 months, you must needs reproach me. However, I examined the curious bird. Conseil was right. The bird, drunk with the juice, was quite powerless. It could not fly. It could hardly walk. This bird belonged to the most beautiful of the 8 species that are found in Papua and in the neighboring islands. It was a large emerald bird, the most rare kind. It measured 3 feet in length. Its head was comparatively small, its eyes placed near the opening of the beak and also small, but the shades of color were beautiful, having a yellow beak, brown feet and claws, nut-colored wings with purple tips, pale yellow at the back of the neck and head, and emerald color at the throat, chestnut on the breast and belly. 2 horned, downy nets rose from below the tail that prolonged the long, light feathers of admirable fineness. And they completed the whole of this marvelous bird that the natives have poetically named the bird of the sun. But if my wishes were satisfied by the possession of the bird of paradise, the Canadians were not yet. Happily, about 2 o'clock, Ned Land brought down a magnificent hog from the brood of those the natives call bari o utang. The animal came in time for us to procure real quadruped meat, and he was well received. Ned Land was very proud of his shot. The hog, hit by the electric ball, fell stone dead. The Canadian skinned and cleaned it properly, after having taken half a dozen cutlets, destined to furnish us with a grilled repast in the evening. Then the hunt was resumed, which was still more marked by Ned and Conseil's exploits. Indeed, the two friends beating the bushes roused a herd of kangaroos that fled and bounded along on their elastic paws. But these animals did not take to flight so rapidly, but what the electric capsule could stop their course. "Ah, Professor!" cried Ned Land, who was carried away by the delights of the chase. "What excellent game! And stewed, too! What a supply for the Nautilus! 2, 3, 5 down, and to think that we shall eat that flesh, and that the idiots on board shall not have a crumb." I think that in the excess of his joy, the Canadian, if he had not talked so much, would have killed them all. But he contented himself with a single dozen of these interesting marsupials. These animals were small. They were a species of those kangaroo rabbits that live habitually in the hollows of trees and whose speed is extreme. But they are moderately fat and furnished at least estimable food. We were very satisfied with the results of the hunt. Happy Ned proposed to return to this enchanting island the next day, for he wished to depopulate it of all the eatable quadrupeds. But he had reckoned without his host. At 6 o'clock in the evening we had regained the shore. Our boat was moored to the usual place. The Nautilus, like a long rock, emerged from the waves 2 miles from the beach. Ned Land, without waiting, occupied himself about the important dinner business. He understood all about cooking well. The bari-outang, grilled on the coals, soon scented the air with a delicious odor. Indeed, the dinner was excellent. 2 wood pigeons completed this extraordinary menu. The sago pastry, the artocarpus bread, some mangoes, half a dozen pineapples, and the liquor fermented from some coconuts overjoyed us. I even think that my worthy companion's ideas had not all the plainness desirable. "Suppose we do not return to the Nautilus this evening," said Conseil. "Suppose we never return," added Ned Land. Just then a stone fell at our feet and cut short the harpooner's proposition. Chapter 21. Captain Nemo's Thunderbolt. We looked at the edge of the forest without rising, my hand stopping in the action of putting it into my mouth, Ned Land's completing its office. "Stones do not fall from the sky," remarked Conseil, "or they would merit the name aerolites." A second stone, carefully aimed, that made a savory pigeon's leg fall from Conseil's hand, gave still more weight to his observation. We all 3 arose, shouldered our guns, and were ready to reply to any attack. "Are they apes?" cried Ned Land. "Very nearly. They are savages." "To the boat!" I said, hurrying to the sea. It was indeed necessary to beat a retreat, for about 20 natives armed with bows and slings appeared on the skirts of a copse that masked the horizon to the right, hardly 100 steps from us. Our boat was moored about 60 feet from us. The savages approached us, not running, but making hostile demonstrations. Stones and arrows fell thickly. Ned Land had not wished to leave his provisions, and in spite of his imminent danger, his pig on one side and kangaroos on the other. He went tolerably fast. In 2 minutes we were on the shore. To load the boat with provisions and arms to push it out to sea and ship the oars was the work of an instant. We had not gone 2 cable lengths when 100 savages, howling and gesticulating, entered the water up to their waists. I watched to see if their apparition would attract some men from the Nautilus onto the platform. But no. The enormous machine lying off was absolutely deserted. 20 minutes later, we were on board. The panels were open. After making the boat fast, we entered into the interior of the Nautilus. I descended into the drawing room, from whence I heard some chords. Captain Nemo was there, bending over his organ and plunged in a musical ecstasy. "Captain!" He did not hear me. "Captain!" I said, touching his hand. He shuddered and turning round said, "Ah, it is you, Professor. Well, have you had a good hunt? Have you botanized successfully?" "Yes, Captain, but we have unfortunately brought a troop of bipeds whose vicinity troubles me." "What bipeds?" "Savages." "Savages!" he echoed ironically. "So you are astonished, Professor, at having set foot on a strange land and finding savages. Savages! Where are there not any? Besides, are they worse than others? These whom you call savages." "But, Captain..." "How many have you counted?" 100 at least." "Monsieur Arenault," replied Captain Nemo, placing his fingers on the organ stops. "When all the natives of Papua are assembled on this shore, the Nautilus will have nothing to fear from their attacks." The captain's fingers were then running over the keys of the instrument, and I remarked that he touched only the black keys, which gave his melodies an essentially Scotch character. Soon he had forgotten my presence and had plunged into a reverie that I did not disturb. I went up again onto the platform. Night had already fallen, for in this low latitude the sun sets rapidly and without twilight. I could only see the island indistinctly, but the numerous fires lighted on the beach showed that the natives did not think of leaving it. I was alone for several hours, sometimes thinking of the natives, but without any dread of them, for the imperturbable confidence of the captain was catching, sometimes forgetting them to admire the splendors of the night of the tropics. To admire the splendors of the night in the tropics. My remembrances went to France, in the train of those zodiacal stars that would shine in some hours' time. The moon shone in the midst of the constellations of the zenith. The night slipped away without any mischance. The islanders, frightened no doubt at the sight of a monster aground in the bay. The panels were opened and would have offered an easy access to the interior of the Nautilus. At 6 o'clock in the morning of the 8th of January, I went up onto the platform. The dawn was breaking. The island soon showed itself through the dissipating fogs. First the shore, then the summits. The natives were there, more numerous than on the day before. 500 or 600 perhaps, some of them, profiting by the low water, had come on to the coral, at less than 2 cable lengths from the Nautilus. I distinguished them easily. They were true Papuans, with athletic figures, men of good race, large, high foreheads, large but not broad and flat, and white teeth. Their woolly hair, with a reddish tinge, showed off on their black shining bodies like those of the Nubians. From the lobes of their ears, cut and distended, hung chaplets of bones. Most of these savages were naked. Almost. Amongst them, I remarked some women, dressed from the hips to knees in quite a crinoline of herbs that sustained a vegetable waistband. Some chiefs had ornamented their necks with a crescent and colors of glass beads, red and white. Nearly all were armed with bows and arrows and shields, and carried on their shoulders a sort of net containing those round stones which they cast from their slings with great skill. One of these chiefs, rather near to the Nautilus, examined it attentively. He was perhaps a amado of high rank, for he was draped in a mat of banana leaves, notched round the edges and set off with brilliant colors. I could easily have knocked down this native, who was within a short length, but I thought that it was better to wait for real hostile demonstrations. Between Europes and savages, it is proper for the Europeans to parry sharply, not to attack. During low water, the natives roamed about near the Nautilus, but were not troublesome. I heard them frequently repeat the word "Asai," and by their gestures I understood that they invited me to go on land, an invitation that I declined. So that on that day the boat did not push off, to the great displeasure of Master Land, who could not complete his provisions. This adroit Canadian employed this time in preparing the viands and meat that he had brought off the island. As for the savages, they returned to the shore about 11 o'clock in the morning, as soon as the coral tops began to disappear under the rising tide. But I saw their numbers had increased considerably on the shore. Probably they came from the neighboring islands, or very likely from Papua. However, I had not seen a single native canoe. Having nothing better to do, I thought of dragging these beautiful limpid waters, under which I saw a profusion of shells, zoophytes, and marine plants. Moreover, it was the last day that the Nautilus would pass in these parts, if it float in open sea the next day, according to Captain Nemo's promise. I therefore called Conseil, who brought me a little light drag, very like those for the oyster fishery. Now to work! For 2 hours we fished unceasingly, but without bringing up any rarities. The drag was filled with Midas ears, harps, melems, and particularly the most beautiful hammers I have ever seen. We also brought up some sea slugs, pearl oysters, and a dozen little turtles that were reserved for the pantry on board. But just when I expected it least, I put my hand on a wonder, I might say a natural deformity, very rarely met with. Conseil was just dragging, and his net came up filled with divers ordinary shells, when all at once he saw me plunge my arm quickly into the net to draw out a shell, and heard me utter a cry. "What is the matter, sir?" he asked in surprise. Has master been bitten?" "No, my boy, but I would willingly have given a finger for my discovery." "What discovery?" "This shell," I said, holding up the object of my triumph. "It is simply an olive porphyry." Porphyry, a hard, ingenious rock containing crystals, usually of feldspar, and a fine-grained, typically reddish ground mass. It is simply an olive porphyry. Side note, genus species missing. End side note. "Yes, Conseil, but instead of being rolled from right to left, this olive turns from left to right." "Is it possible?" Yes, my boy, it is a left shell. Shells are all right-handed, with rare exceptions, and when by chance their spiral is left, amateurs are ready to pay their weight in gold. Conseil and I were absorbed in the contemplation of our treasure, and I was promising myself to enrich the museum with it, when a stone, unfortunately thrown by a native, struck against and broke the precious object in Conseil's hand. I uttered a cry of despair. Conseil took up his gun and aimed at a savage who was poising his sling at 10 yards from him. I would have stopped him, but his blow took effect and broke the bracelet of amulets which encircled the arm of the savage. "Conseil!" cried I. "Conseil!" "Well, sir, did you not see that the cannibal has commenced the attack?" "A shell is not worth the life of a man," said I. "Ah, the scoundrel!" cried Conseil. "I would rather he had broken my shoulder." Conseil was in earnest, but I was not of his opinion. However, the situation had changed some minutes before, and we had not perceived. A score of canoes surrounded the Nautilus. These canoes scooped out of the trunk of a tree, long, narrow, well adapted for speed, were balanced by means of a long bamboo pole, which floated on the water. They were managed by skillful, half-naked paddlers, and I watched their advance with some uneasiness. It was evident that these Papuans had already had dealings with the Europeans and knew their ships. But this long iron cylinder anchored in the bay, without masts or chimneys, what could they think of it? Nothing good, for at first they kept at a respectful distance. However, seeing it motionless, by degrees they took courage and sought to familiarize themselves with it. Now, this familiarity was precisely what it was necessary to avoid. Our arms, which were noiseless, could only produce a moderate effect on the savages, who have little respect for aught but blustering things. The thunderbolt, without the reverberations of thunder, would frighten man but little, though the danger lies in the lightning, not in the noise. At this moment the canoes approached the Nautilus, and a shower of arrows alighted on her. I went down to the saloon, but found no one there. I ventured to knock at the door that opened into the captain's room. "Come in," was the answer. I entered and found Captain Nemo deep in algebraical calculations of x and other quantities. "I am disturbing you," said I, for courtesy's sake. "That is true, Monsieur Aronnax," replied the captain. "But I think you have serious reasons for wishing to see me." "Very grave ones. The natives are surrounding us in their canoes, and in a few minutes we shall certainly be attacked by many hundreds of savages." "Ah," said Captain Nemo quietly. "They are come with their canoes?" "Yes, sir, we." "Well, sir, we must close the hatches." "Exactly, and I came to say to you—" "Nothing can be more simple," said Captain Nemo, and pressing an electric button, he transmitted an order to the ship's crew. "It's all done, sir," said he after a few moments. "The pinnace is ready, and the hatches are closed. You do not fear, I imagine, that these gentlemen could stave in walls on which the balls of your frigate have had no effect?" "No, Captain, but a danger still exists." "What is that, sir?" "Is it that tomorrow, at about this hour, we must open the hatches to renew the air of the Nautilus? Now, if at this moment the Papuans should occupy the platform, I do not see how you could prevent them from entering." "Then, sir, you suppose that they will board us?" "I am certain of it." Well, sir, let them come. I see no reason for hindering them. After all, these Papuans are poor creatures, and I am unwilling that my visit to the island should cost the life of a single one of these wretches. Upon that I was going away, but Captain Nemo detained me and asked me to sit down with him. He questioned me with interest about our excursions on shore and our hunting, and seemed not to understand the craving for meat that possessed the Canadian. Then the conversations turned on various subjects, and without being more communicative, Captain Nemo showed himself more amiable. Amongst other things, we happened to speak of the situation of the Nautilus, run aground in exactly the same spot in this strait where Dumont d'Urville was nearly lost. Apropos of this d'Urville was one of your great sailors, said the captain to me, one of your most intelligent navigators. He is the captain cook of you Frenchmen, unfortunate man of science, after having braved the icebergs of the South Pole, the coral reefs of Oceania, the cannibals of the Pacific, to perish miserably in a railway train. If this energetic man could have reflected during the last moments of his life, what must have been uppermost in his last thoughts, do you suppose? So speaking, Captain Nemo seemed moved, and his emotion gave me a better opinion of him. Then, chart in hand, we reviewed the travels of the French navigator, his voyages of circumnavigation, his double detention at the South Pole, which led to the discovery of Adelaide and Louis Philippe, and fixing the hydrographical bearings of the principal islands of Oceania. That which your d'Urville has done on the surface of the seas, said Captain Nemo, that have I done under them, and more easily, more completely than he. The Astrolabe and the Zelee, incessantly tossed about by the hurricane, could not be worth the Nautilus, quite repository of labor that she is, truly motionless in the midst of the waters. Tomorrow, added the captain, rising, tomorrow at 20 minutes to 3 p.m., the Nautilus shall float and leave the Strait of Torres uninjured. Having curtly pronounced these words, Captain Nemo bowed slightly. This was to dismiss me, and I went back to my room. There I found Conseil, who wished to know the result of my interview with the captain. "My boy," said I, "when I feigned to believe that his Nautilus was threatened by the natives of the Papua, the captain answered me very sarcastically. I have but one thing to say to you. Have confidence in him and go to sleep in peace." "Have you no need of my services, sir?" "No, my friend. What is Ned Land doing?" "If you will excuse me, sir," answered Conseil, "friend Ned is busy making a kangaroo pie which will be marvel." I remained alone and went to bed, but slept indifferently. I heard the noise of the savages, who stamped on the platform, uttering deafening cries. The night passed thus, without disturbing the ordinary repose of the crew. The presence of these cannibals affected them no more than the soldiers of a masked battery care for the ants that crawl over its front. At 6 in the morning I rose. The hatches had not been opened, the inner air was not renewed, but the reservoirs filled ready for an emergency. We were now resorted to. The inner air was not renewed, but the reservoirs filled ready for an emergency were now resorted to, and discharged several cubic feet of oxygen into the exhausted atmosphere of the Nautilus. I worked in my room till noon, without having seen Captain Nemo, even for an instant. On board, no preparations for departure were visible. I waited still some time, then went into the large saloon. The clock marked 2:30. In 10 minutes it would be high tide, and if Captain Nemo had not made a rash promise, the Nautilus would be immediately detached. If not, many months would pass ere she could leave her bed of coral. However, some warning vibrations began to be felt in the vessel. I heard the keel grating against the rough, calcareous bottom of the coral reef. At 3:20, Captain Nemo appeared in the saloon. "We are going to start," said he. "Ah," replied I. "I have given the order to open the hatches." "And the Papuans?" "The Papuans?" answered Captain Nemo, slightly shrugging his shoulders. "Will they not come inside the Nautilus?" "How?" "Only by leaping over the hatches you have opened." "Monsieur Arono," quietly answered Captain Nemo, "they will not enter the hatches of the Nautilus in that way, even if they were open." I looked at the captain. "You do not understand?" said he. "Hardly." "Well, come and you will see." I directed my steps towards the central staircase. There, Ned Land and Conseil were slyly watching some of the ship's crew who were opening the hatches, while cries of rage and fearful vociferations resounded outside. The port lids were pulled down outside. 20 horrible faces appeared, but the first native who placed his hand on the stair rail, struck from behind by some invisible force, I know not what, fled, uttering the most fearful cries and making the wildest contortions. 10 of his companions followed him. They met with the same fate. Conseil was in ecstasy. Ned Land, carried away by his violent instincts, rushed on to the staircase. But the moment he seized the rail with both hands, he, in his turn, was overthrown. "I am struck by a thunderbolt!" cried he with an oath. This explained all. It was no rail, but a metallic cable charged with electricity from the deck communicating with the platform. Whoever touched it felt a powerful shock, and this shock would have been mortal if Captain Nemo had discharged into the conductor the whole force of the current. It might truly be said that between his assailants and himself, he had stretched a network of electricity which none could pass with impunity. Meanwhile, the exasperated Papuans had beaten a retreat paralyzed with terror. As for us, half laughing, we consoled and rubbed the unfortunate Ned Land, who swore like one possessed. But at this moment, the Nautilus, raised by the last waves of the tide, quitted her coral bed exactly at the 40th minute fixed by the captain. Her screw swept the water slowly and majestically. Her speed increased gradually, and sailing on the surface of the ocean, she quitted safe and sound the dangerous passes of the Straits of Torres.